I'm going to talk about, the book that we're talking about tonight for me is the book that I wrote in May 2018 called The New Working Class, How to Win Hearts, Minds and Votes. And essentially it analyses who's working class today and what do people actually want. So some of it dovetails with some of what Stephen said, but some of it is much broader. And I'm going to talk about some of those findings tonight. We did joke as we came in to say that one party clearly read it and the other party didn't, and I can absolutely vouch for you that is true from the experiences that I had. So I'm going to talk about what happened, who we're actually talking about when we're talking about working class voters, why I think we got the result that we did in December, a bit about what I think comes next, and then a couple of conclusions about what it means for brands and communications. So what happened? Well, we know the overall result, and obviously the big story of the night was this huge focus on these historic working class constituencies that went from red to blue, and obviously that was a really, really important development. But a lot was going on. I feel like it was one of those nights out where you're all focused on the fact that that friend got together with that friend and that's a scandal, but all this other stuff was going on and that's kind of consumed all the attention. If you look at what was going on in Scotland and in North Wales and in lots of other constituencies around the UK and all the demographic shifts in London, there was actually huge amounts to unpick at that election. But what I want to focus on is that big story, and I guess my take from the research that I've done about the big story of the night. So looking at the data then, so did the Conservatives win the working class? Yes, they did. So we can see here, this is from YouGov, their immediate analysis, and there'll be more to come because the big British election study is done next month. But their initial analysis shows that the Conservatives won. If you can't see the breakdowns, these blue bars at the bottom, I mean, they're pretty crude definitions of class. It's usually based on your occupation. But ABC won, did you know that? 43% Tory. C2Ds is 48% for the Conservatives and 33% for Labour, which is historically really important. And I understand why we would focus on the campaign and why we would focus on Corbyn being an issue, but this has been going on for 20 years. So my first message to you is that there are really big shifts that have been going on underneath the personalities and the politics and that huge chunky manifesto with all of its giveaways. But the problems for Labour did not start when Jeremy Corbyn was elected. They didn't even start with the Brexit referendum. They started in about, it's basically pretty straightforward. This is 1960 right the way to 2020. And that line at the top is voter choice amongst the working class is the red line is Labour. Labour support starts to fall away amongst working class voters from the late 1990s onwards, and it drops and it drops, and actually turnout starts to fall, it drops and it drops. Corbyn pushed some of those voters up in 2017, but it dropped down again in 2019, that's where the next bit of the chart would be. So that's the first conclusion, is that the what happened starts 20 years ago, not any of those other moments in terms of the more recent history. I think it's really important that we think about who we're talking about, because I think there's a lot of stereotyping of what it means to be working class today. And I agree with Steve in terms of the kind of size of Britain's working class is actually much bigger than I think politicians have perhaps thought of it in the last 20 years or so. Often when politicians started talking about working class voters, and they haven't talked about working class voters very much, and that's part of the story that I want to tell, they're often talking about the traditional working class, which is an important but shrinking part of the population. It's probably only about 14% of the population. What I've argued is that today's working class is much, much bigger, but people don't necessarily identify themselves as being working class. And I use the Great British Class Survey, which the London School of Economics produced some years ago, to group some of these different groupings together. And they had the traditional working class in there, but they also have what they call the precariat, so people who, it's a bit of a policy term, but we've all got our own terms. The precariat, people who may or may not be in work, but are definitely struggling to make ends meet. Lots of people who've got disabilities, who have got caring requirements, who cannot go out to work full-time for one reason or another. So the precariat, the traditional working class, and what these analysts call the emerging service workers. And what I wanted to do was try and say that actually what it means to be working class today has completely altered from the traditional view of class. It is much, much more diverse. So I strongly would argue that the working class today is multi-ethnic. There is a group that's the white working class, but frankly, all of these groupings have always had some mix in them, and emerging service workers in particular have many more ethnic minorities than the traditional working class. And it's not a group that answers to one single definition of class, it's made up of multiple groupings. So for years, politicians have been trying to compete for the aspirational voter, the middle class, the aspirational working class, but wanting to move into the middle class. So you might remember the Mondeo man and the Worcester woman. So this complete fixation on marginal seats where they felt that they, both the Tories and Labour could compete for this particular type of voter. You'll all be familiar with them. We've just seen sort of two sets of what we might call cluster groupings. You'll be hugely familiar with how you do this in your own organisations. But I think that Labour during those years made two big miscalculations. The first was, and they were quite explicit about it, that their traditional support would have nowhere to go. And I think we saw the first shakings of that around the votes around UKIP. And I'm from London, but moved up to York to work for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation a few years ago. And to look at the map after the European elections, I think it was maybe 2015, and see York was a little spot of red in a sea of purple. And I hadn't understood that. I came from a very, very mixed, diverse upbringing in London, and something was going on there that I think many of us perhaps weren't attuned to. But the first miscalculation was voters have nowhere to go. The second is the changing nature of the economy, and actually it's that John Harris quote at the end, really, in terms of looking at the fact that the changes we've had to the economy in the last 30 years or so have not left everybody feeling middle class, and that feels a really obvious thing to say. But we've ended up with an economy where there are some big winners actually, but there are also people who are struggling on low wages, on jobs that just do not give them enough hours or enough security to be able to advance and move on. People who just feel stuck, people who might well be in work actually, many of them are in work. But there are consequences to that, and I suppose one of the challenges I guess I would give to the picture that Stephen was describing is that I don't think the distinction between poverty and what it means to be working class is as clear cut as it maybe once was, because I think there are lots and lots of people who we might consider at the JRF that they are in poverty, but they are in work, but the wages aren't enough, or they are really, really struggling, and much of our social security system is really propping up low wages and people who are unable to work full time. So I don't think those distinctions are as true as they were. So I put those groupings together and described what I'd call this new working class, and really it was a way of saying change the stereotype that you have of what it means to be working class, understand that it's not one homogenous group. Most of those people will not identify themselves necessarily as being working class, and it's also not distant. And I don't know about you, but after the 2016 referendum, it suddenly felt like all these camera crews went to Stoke-on-Trent and Hartlepool and observed these kind of from a sort of a long distance what was going on for people, and it was almost like they were peering at something else. And part of what we wanted to be able to say was people who are working class are in every workplace, every community, every place of worship, every pub, every high street. This is not about observing some distant group that is somewhere in a coastal town or somewhere in a former industrial area. It's absolutely about the people that we are living and working alongside. And I think their story is one of being overlooked in politics in the last few years. So essentially that would lead to my offer of what I think happened, why I think those constituencies went over in the end, is I think there are some what I'd call more short-term factors. So we've covered some of them in terms of Hannah Stevens' presentation, but obviously the factors around Corbyn personally as a leader. Some of Labour's policies were actually quite popular, so when you poll them, some of what they were saying were popular, but they were completely obscured and overloaded, and some of them were just not popular at all. But it was very difficult to actually get a clear picture of what Labour was trying to say. But fundamentally, I think it is about identity and not really about the policies. The policies were relevant in terms of people saying this doesn't speak to my life and who this party is. So I think fundamentally it is a problem about brand and the symbols and signals that that party were giving off. And a week or so ago, YouGov did another poll, and they looked at people who previously had voted Labour, but for the first time voted Conservative this time. And the thing that I thought was most stark was it was 74% of them said something like, Labour used to represent people like me and now doesn't. And now over half start to feel like the Conservatives do represent them. And for Labour, that is a huge issue, that if people's identities have started to become bound up with another party and their identity has been lost from this bigger working class, then it is a huge problem. And for me, Brexit kind of pushed them over the line. For some people, did want to get Brexit done, but for some people, they just saw that as a symbol of, well, that's the final. I didn't turn out in 2005. I didn't bother turning out in 2010. Might have even voted for Corbyn in 2017, but I just can't do it this time. And I think that was what pushed them over the line. The Conservatives also retained their Remainers better than Labour retained their Leavers. So the Conservatives managed to keep their coalition, if you like, together better than Labour managed to keep theirs together. So what happens next? Well, clearly the Conservatives are going to be really keen to hold on to their new votes, and actually overall their vote share didn't actually go up that much. And I think it was when Johnson said that thing about you've lent us your votes, I think that was that indication of, you know, if you've just been elected into one of those constituencies, you're going to do everything you can to get your parliamentary party to prioritise the interests in your constituencies. And from JRF's point of view, so we're an organisation that works on UK poverty, we will be working with those MPs to try and do as much as we can to make sure that the investment that we hope is coming is actually going to make a meaningful difference to people, because ultimately that's what we're in it for. So I think the Conservatives have got an opportunity now, but it's about whether it makes that really difference on the ground. Labour have got a huge decision to make in terms of not just their leader, but their strategy and what they think they stand for today. I think part of my worry is political disengagement, and what if the Conservatives don't deliver, or people just break off again and people start to think, actually, well, they're both as bad as each other. Like, what then? What happens then? Ultimately, what I would want to see is I want the parties to be competing for these votes. I want them to be seeing this as important as they saw the Worcester woman and the Mondeo man. I want them to be appealing to people who are working class, because I think there are so many people who feel they haven't had a voice. It's vitally important. So in terms of conclusions for brands, one thing that I think has really emerged has been what we might call these values divides. So the fact that people's values are driving part of their reactions to politics and politicians. And JRF cares passionately about poverty, but we know that there are really divisive narratives and stereotypes about people in poverty. So we've been working with the Frameworks Institute from the US about how we can tell a different story about poverty that actually cuts through some of these divides and understands what are the most powerful values combinations we can use to try and get people to act and to care about poverty. And the research they've done for us shows that compassion and justice combined for us is the strongest way to shift to action on poverty. And I mention this in connection with brands, because values are actually, I think, what is deeper even than those identities. So actually, if we can get political parties to understand they need to connect with people's values, we think that's incredibly important. And what we want to do is find areas where there can be, in our quite diverse society and all of its multiple groupings, how do you try and bridge it? How do you try and build alliances? Because frankly, I think actually, if we end up with a situation where we have more people who see that others as something else they cannot connect to, then I think we are in deeper trouble, and that goes well beyond party politics. And finally, what we've been able to do is identify the metaphors. So we've identified the metaphors that we think will really stick in people's minds. So we are a foundation that was funded by our founder, Joseph Rowntree, 100 years ago. So we're in the fortunate position that we don't have to fundraise. So we've been offering free training up and down the country to activists, campaigners, people in charities who feel very isolated, who feel very despondent, not particularly about politics necessarily, but about the levels of destitution and poverty they see. And we are equipping them with the skills and the language to move people to more productive frames to really have action on poverty. So as an example, we found that actually giving that mental image that poverty is something that is restricting people and constraining people rather than being about, well, so-and-so down the road did all right, so we all can. How can we understand some of these issues of low-paid, insecure work? People get low wages, they get that the benefit system traps them, they get that costs are rising for them. How do we describe it in ways that really, really connect with people? And how do we enable that to allow people to kind of break free from a poverty which is constraining them? So I'm interested in looking at different groups, but I'm really interested in how we actually use the understanding we've got to move people to a more collective place, an understanding where we can really say that actually we need to achieve decent living standards across the country, because if we have deeper inequality and more division over our values, then I don't think we end up in a good place. So my ask would be, for a takeaway for tonight, is I can send round the toolkit that we have for JRF, but to where possible in your communications, to use more productive frames so that we can have better collective action to some of these really big societal challenges that we're now seeing some of the political implications of.